Hello, and welcome back to Architecture Topics. I'm your host, Liam Karen, and today's episode is a little different. This time we won't be talking about a building, but about one of the most basic elements in all of architecture, a wall. Not any wall, though. We'll be talking about one of the most famous walls ever built, the Berlin Wall, a line so powerful it split a city, a country, and the world itself for almost 3 decades. It divided families, neighborhoods, and even ideas about what the future should look like. And yet at its core, it was just that, a wall, a brutally simple piece of architecture built not to inspire, but to contain. Now, to understand how Berlin ended up divided by a wall, we have to go back to the end of World War II. When the Second World War ended in 1945, Germany was in ruins. Its cities were reduced to rubble, its industries destroyed, and its government gone. The victorious Allies, the United States, the United Kingdom, France, and the Soviet Union, divided the country into 4 occupation zones. Each power would oversee one zone, responsible for rebuilding, demilitarizing, and shaping Germany's future. But there was a catch. Berlin, the capital, lay right in the middle of the Soviet zone. And since nobody wanted to give up the capital, the city too was divided into 4 parts, one for each Allied power. West Berlin literally became an island on Soviet territory. At first, the arrangement seemed temporary, a practical way to stabilize a defeated nation. But as relations between the Western Allies and the Soviets deteriorated, things started to change. By 1947, 2 very different visions for Germany were taking shape. In the West, the Allies encouraged recovery through the Marshall Plan, rebuilding the economy and promoting democratic governance. While in the East, the Soviets imposed central control, nationalized industries, and tightened political power. The tension came to a head in 1948 when Stalin tried to push the Western powers out of Berlin by cutting off all road, rail, and canal access to the city. It was the first great crisis of the Cold War. West Berliners suddenly found themselves trapped. 2 million people surrounded by hostile territory. But instead of abandoning the city, the Allies responded with an extraordinary effort, the Berlin Airlift. For almost a year, American and British planes landed every few minutes, day and night, bringing in food, coal, and medicine. This went on until 1949, when the blockade finally ended. By then, the message was clear. The West wasn't going to give up Berlin, and the city's fate, from that moment on, was sealed. In 1949, Germany was officially split into 2. The Western zones united to form the Federal Republic of Germany, known as West Germany, with Bonn as its capital, while the Soviet zone became the German Democratic Republic, or East Germany, ruled from East Berlin. Berlin itself, though, remained divided in 4 sectors, with 4 flags and 4 armies, all inside a single ruined city. In the West, cranes rose again, streets filled with the hum of commerce and the promise of recovery. American aid poured in, and with it came jazz, blue jeans, and neon signs. West Berlin became a laboratory for democracy, an island of capitalism surrounded by a sea of socialism. In the East, the mood was different. Soviet-backed leaders rebuilt in a more austere style, guided by ideology rather than market forces. Propaganda filled the streets with slogans of equality and progress, while secret police kept a watchful eye on anyone who doubted that narrative. For more than a decade, Berlin existed like this: 1 city, 2 systems. And for a while, people could still move freely between the sectors. Thousands crossed the border every day. Workers, shoppers, families. But by the late 1950s, East Germany was hemorrhaging people. Over 2.5 million citizens had fled west since the war. many of them young and educated. Exactly the people the regime could least afford to lose. Trains leaving East Berlin were packed with families carrying suitcases, pretending to visit relatives, knowing they might never return. Each departure was a quiet act of defiance, and each one weakened the state. So, by the summer of 1961, the East German government made a drastic decision. If they couldn't convince their citizens to stay, they would simply make it impossible to leave. It happened on a Sunday. In the early hours of August 13th, 1961, soldiers and police from East Germany began rolling out barbed wire across Berlin streets. They worked quietly but relentlessly, under orders from the very top. By sunrise, roads were closed, train lines severed, and sidewalks cut in half. Families woke up to find that what had been a single city just hours earlier was now two. Neighbors could see each other from their windows, but no longer visit. Streetcars stopped mid-route. People who'd gone dancing or visiting friends in the West couldn't return home. The barbed wire fence was strengthened with concrete blocks within days, and that became version 1 of the wall. Watchtowers began to rise, manned by armed guards. Streets that once connected neighborhoods became dead ends. It wasn't just a physical separation. It was also psychological. An overnight transformation of trust into suspicion and of open movement into confinement. Some East Berliners refused to accept it. They tried to run across the barriers, climb windows, even jump from apartment buildings that straddled the border. Some made it, others didn't. The East German government called it the Anti-Fascist Protection Rampart. But everyone knew what it really was. A prison wall built to keep its own citizens inside. From then on, Berlin would live divided, and the wall, crude as it was, would keep evolving for almost 3 decades. Over time, engineers developed 4 main versions, each more permanent and efficient than the last. By 1962, the second version appeared. This time it was reinforced. Thicker concrete slabs, steel beams, and a parallel fence, creating a narrow, restricted zone patrolled by soldiers. East Germans called it the Death Strip. Then came the third generation in the late 1960s. Prefabricated concrete panels with smoother surfaces, harder to climb, and easier to replace. Behind it ran a patrol road, lined with floodlights and watchtowers spaced every 100 meters. Finally, by the 1980s, the fourth and final version emerged. This is the version that most people today picture when they think of the Berlin Wall. It was about 3.6 meters high, built of precast concrete segments 1.2 meters wide, each topped with a rounded pipe. That smooth pipe wasn't decorative. It made the top nearly impossible to grip, or to attach a hook to in order to rope over the wall, transforming a simple wall into a sophisticated, inescapable barrier. It was a mass-produced piece of architecture optimized for containment and control. In total, 45,000 interlocking segments were put together, making up an approximately 54-kilometer segment within the 155-kilometer perimeter that surrounded the West. Behind the main wall stretched a fortified strip of land. Anti-vehicle trenches, signal fences wired with alarms, raked sand to detect footprints, dog runs, patrol tracks, and more towers. From the air, it looked like a long scar of white and gray cutting across the city, a space of total exposure where every movement was visible. The materials were simple: concrete, steel, gravel, and wire. But the geometry was deliberate. Every angle, every line was meant to eliminate cover, control sightlines, and maximize surveillance. The wall was architecture stripped to its bare function, the pure design of division. For those who lived with it, The wall was not just a border. It was a daily presence, visible, constant, and inescapable. It sliced through the heart of Berlin, ignoring logic or geography. Streets ended abruptly. Railway lines stopped mid-track. Rivers, gardens, and even graveyards were cut in half. From some windows, you could see the other side, close enough to wave. Families stood separated by just a few meters of concrete. And children grew up hearing voices across the divide that they could never reach. For West Berliners, the wall was a grim backdrop to daily life, a reminder that their freedom was fragile. For those on the East, it was a warning. Stay in, don't question, don't dream of leaving. But people did dream, and some refused to give up. In the first years, many tried to escape however they could. Some jumped from apartment windows before they were bricked up. Others tunneled beneath gardens and basements, inching their way under the death strip. There were swimmers crossing rivers at night, families hidden inside cars, and even a homemade hot air balloon that drifted silently into the west. Each attempt carried immense risk. Border guards had orders to shoot anyone trying to flee, and they killed more than 100 people trying to cross, some just steps away from freedom. And yet, the attempts never stopped. Every escape, every tunnel, every balloon was a small act of defiance, proof that walls, no matter how solid, could never fully contain human hope. For the East German government, the wall required constant maintenance. Patrols repaired cracks, repainted surfaces, checked fences and alarms, trimmed the grass in the death strip so footprints would be visible. It was kept spotless, almost sterile. No signs of neglect allowed. On the western side, though, it was the opposite. The wall became a canvas. Over time, artists, protesters, and ordinary citizens covered it in paint and words. A chaotic explosion of color facing the gray monotony of the East. Graffiti turned the wall into a conversation. Political slogans, poems, jokes, and abstract murals transformed concrete into protest. It became a living record of resistance, changing with every layer of paint. By the late 1980s, the world around East Germany was changing fast. Across Eastern Europe, communist governments were beginning to fall. The Soviet Union itself was opening up under Gorbachev's reforms. And inside East Germany, pressure was building. Protests filled the streets of Leipzig and Dresden. Thousands demanded freedom of speech, open borders, and the right to travel. The regime tried to hold on, but it was losing control of its own narrative. Then, on the evening of November 9th, 1989, everything unraveled, almost by accident. A government spokesman, reading from a hastily written note at a live press conference, announced that East Germans would soon be allowed to travel freely to the West. A journalist then asked, when would the new policy take effect? He hesitated, looked down at his papers, and said the words that would change history. He said, "As far as I know, effective immediately." Within hours, thousands of people were crowding the checkpoints, shouting, pushing, and demanding to cross. The border guards, confused and overwhelmed, had received no clear orders. And so, one by one, they began to let people through. The moment spread like wildfire. Crowds poured through the checkpoints. Others climbed over the wall itself. People hugged, cried, and danced on top of the very structure that had divided them for nearly 30 years. Soldiers who once patrolled with rifles now stood smiling in disbelief. And then came the sound. Ordinary citizens took whatever tools and machinery they could get their hands on and threw themselves against the wall. They came with hammers, chisels, even kitchen utensils. Anything that could chip away at the concrete that had held them apart. Each strike echoed like a declaration. Each fragment that fell felt like a piece of history being reclaimed. Soon the air filled with dust, cheers, headlights, and laughter. People climbed, embraced, and passed bottles of champagne through the cracks. The wall that for almost 3 decades had symbolized fear and separation was now being dismantled by the very people it tried to contain. When the dust settled, Berlin was no longer a city divided, but a city rediscovering itself. In the months that followed, workers cleared the ruins of the wall. Streets reconnected, train lines reopened, and the flow of life slowly returned. What had once been a scar cutting through the city began to heal. Yet, traces of the wall never disappeared completely. A few fragments were preserved, standing alone in parks and plazas. Others were shipped around the world as reminders of a time when ideology could take physical form. Today, a stretch of the wall still stands along the Spree River. It's called the East Side Gallery, more than a kilometer of painted concrete, covered in murals celebrating freedom, hope, and unity. The very surface that once silenced expression now overflows with it. In Berlin's urban fabric, the line of the wall is still there too, marked by double rows of cobblestones that trace its old path through streets and sidewalks. People cross it every day without even noticing. But memory lingers because the wall was never just a barrier of concrete and steel. It was a mirror, reflecting the fears, divisions, and ambitions of an entire era. And it reminds us of something which we should never forget. And that is that the built environment is never neutral. It shapes how we move, how we meet, and how we live together. In this case, something as simple as a wall shaped the destiny of millions. Every window, every street, every threshold carries power. The power to connect or to divide, to include or to exclude. And that power comes with responsibility. A responsibility shared by architects, engineers, politicians, and anyone who helps shape the spaces we inhabit. Because a wall isn't just a wall, a window isn't just a window, and a city isn't just a collection of buildings. It's a reflection of who we are, and more importantly, who we want to be. And that, dear listener, is all for today. I hope you found this episode meaningful, even if the story can be difficult to listen to. A reminder of times that don't reflect the best of us as a society or as human beings, but are equally important, if not more, to remember. Thank you for listening, and I'll see you next week with another story. Until then, keep looking up.